Welcome, listeners, to Advanced TV Herstory. Now, before computers and their ability to conjure up words and images, and long before streaming services, the hardworking women and men of the entertainment industry worked with their unions just like so many other folks in a myriad of professions, blue and white collar. My first union job was at the age of 13, and I'm the daughter of an airline union employee who used his long-term disability benefits until he drew his last breath. My grandfather was a member of the Minneapolis Firefighters Union, and my mother-in-law was a middle school teacher on Long Island. Bless the Teachers Unions of America. So in preparation for this Labor Day, let's look at the work of the entertainment unions and all of the tremendous things they've done regarding ethnic diversity, gender equity, red baiting, and blacklisting. The working conditions for all the different crafts and trades that work long hours to bring us all of this entertainment. Plus, credit where credit is due, because when you have egos involved and creative work, sometimes fighting over credit turns into a big deal. Conflicts of interest, mutual support for trade contracts within a larger union. It's a very complex industry, not like typical employer-union relationships, because there are just so many different players and handlers when it comes to making a movie or a TV series. And finally, the stars of this drama for today are the major unions in the entertainment field, the Writers Guild of America, also known as the WGA, and the Screen Actors Guild / the American Federation of Television and Radio Actors, also known as SAG-AFTRA. And we're going to even find out more about the story of how it is that SAG and AFTRA joined. So here at Advanced TV Herstory, as you know, we like to take a deeper look at the facts and the milestones that help us connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. So sit back, because Labor Day 2023 will create an opportunity for you to be smarter about the work of the modern union. Want to know more about what we're up to at Advanced TV Herstory? Please go to tvherstory.com and sign up for our monthly newsletter. I promise your information is private and our lists are never sold or shared. Let's give a drum roll for Meredith Stiehm, Lisa Takeuchi Cullen, and Fran Drescher, who are the entertainment union leaders in the strike that will define the use of technology in creating and distributing the audio and visual arts as we know them today. Stiehm and Cullen are the second and third women to serve as presidents of the Writers Guild of America West and East, and Cullen just assumed her role months ago, just months before the WGA strike began. So, SAG and AFTRA, both before the unions merged and after, have actually a very strong history of women leadership, 9 in all. Entertainment's labor movement has very much benefited from the hard work and foresight of women who have fought for change and improvement. And that's really important. We don't know all that much about union history unless you are a union employee and you understand the workings of your union in particular. But when we think about the visibility of SAG and AFTRA and the WGA, the world, it really is watching. Before the merger with SAG, AFTRA elected these following women to the president position: Virginia Payne, Vicki Viola, Shelby Scott, and Roberta Reardon. And over at SAG before the merger, Kathleen Nolan, Patty Duke, and Melissa Gilbert served as president. And just following the 2012 merger, Gabrielle Carteris was the second leader of the merged SAG-AFTRA. Here's Fran Drescher.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, everybody, for coming to this press conference today. It's really important that this negotiation be covered because the eyes of the world, and particularly the eyes of labor, are upon us. What happens here is important because what's happening to us is happening across all fields of labor by means of when employers make Wall Street and greed their priority, and they forget about the essential contributors that make the machine run. We have a problem.
There are many ways to find out about what the major components of the negotiations were leading up to the, at this point, stalemate and the now weeks and weeks long strike of both WGA and SAG-AFTRA. But the lines in the sand, for the most part, are focused on payments for work that now is available to be seen on streaming as opposed to simply the networks and cable TV. Those elements, that stuff has all been baked into contracts long ago. Recent contracts didn't anticipate how shows would be both produced as well as distributed and owned in today's world. It's a bit of a Byzantine and high finance and very leveraged business. Only in the last year, however, had use of artificial intelligence really come to create scripts and other written material that people who are producing TV and film want to use. And yet this stuff is being created with no required agreement of who had ever written the material on which it was based, or in the case of the actors, use of their likeness and computerized renderings. There's no permission, there's no money. The principals, the people who at this point are the creative force, are being starved out of their jobs. So, yes, this is a seminal moment. So when reviewing union highlights, we're going to stick to themes of equity and payment and benefits that are comparable to non-entertainment industry work. The interesting thing is that this is sort of work that we know, a business that we know just enough about to be dangerous. In 1931, Boris Karloff, wearing all of his makeup and costume as Frankenstein for the movie Frankenstein, had to endure a 25-hour shooting day, and it nearly broke him. And so he filed a complaint with, at that time, sort of what existed as the union, and that was the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which we know today now delivers the Oscar. 2 years later, the Screen Actors Guild was founded because so many actors were starting to realize that their rights were not being recognized, that their rights were not being respected. And by September 28th of 1933, the Depression was really starting to sink in. There were only 54 members. There were no top stars. It took a couple of years, but the conversations about unions became very loud and pronounced. For instance, what to do with extras and how do they get paid? Remember Gone with the Wind, 1939? If you look closely, when Scarlett O'Hara is walking through that incredible town square where there are all of those wounded soldiers and dead soldiers and bodies and horses and everything, if you look closely, many of them are not moving because they were not people, they were mannequins. That's the kind of issue that the union wanted to make sure they had a hand in calling. Also, by 1935, going to go back a bit because Gone with the Wind was 1938 and 39. By 1935, SAG was granted the American Federation of Labor Charter, which made it an official union. And by the year's end, in fact, there were locals in New York, LA, Chicago, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Detroit, because filmmaking was still rather decentralized. And believe it or not, just 3 years later, 1938, when TVs were incredibly expensive and incredibly rare, the union, which is called Actors' Equity, was asserting that it had jurisdictional claim over the television performers who were at the start of that budding medium. And they put in their magazine that they had this claim, and the New York Times covered it. And here's the headline from the New York Times, 1938. Labor worries beset industry not yet born. That's how long ago television was recognized as a very powerful medium. Now, the other interesting thing about the entertainment field is that it deals with all sorts of life work, sorts of conditions, like young performers. So there it was toward the end of the 30s, 1938 and 39, where all of a sudden the importance of a lawsuit that a youth performer, a young performer, Jackie Coogan, brought forward ensured that there would be a measure of, though not a perfect, ironclad legal protection of the earnings of young performers in California, only in California. Jackie Coogan, if you really know your TV herstory, or history at least, Jackie Coogan was Uncle Fester in Addams Family, but the loopholes were there, and it was so that parents and guardians could spend without too much oversight the monies that had been earned by young people because it was not considered owned by the young people. They were earning it, but it was not theirs to necessarily spend. And that included Patty Duke as well, who would later become a SAG president. And so what you'll hear from me is that there are some years where the television turf wars, who was going to represent television performers was all over the place. And so Actors Equity and AFTRA, which at the time was the radio union, and SAG, all would get along some years and kind of be at each other's throats other years. You'll also hear a lot about diversity and representation, because this goes back as far as 1943. So you may remember from Gone with the Wind that Hattie McDaniel was the first woman of color to win an Oscar as a supporting actress for her role as Mammy. So a couple of years later, she, as a leader, a Black leader in Hollywood, requested that the Guild, the Screen Actors Guild, form a committee to discuss the problems faced by Black performers in films. And then there's the communists. Throughout the 40s, as there was a certain amount of anti-communist fervor going on, California's legislature had put out a committee that was similar to the House Un-American Activities Committee at the federal level. And they were attempting to prove that one of the union leaders was a communist member. And so SAG responded, and its president, Robert Montgomery, responded, and they issued a rock-hard anti-communist, anti-fascist statement. And they thought it would draw the line in the sand and get red baiting off of the actors' shoulders. But in fact, Montgomery, who was initially opposed to the whole movement vehemently, and the other SAG presidents, including Ronald Reagan and George Murphy, would eventually appear before the federal House Un-American Activities Committee as friendly witnesses. And that is some of the conversation that you may remember, a series that I did that was derived from a very important conversation I had with Carol Stabile, talking about the Broadcast 41 and all of the anti-communist fervor and the impact it had on so many women who were at the early stages of television. So SAG adopted a conflict of interest bylaw in the 40s, late 40s as well, and that was really to keep members from abusing power and rights. And they also adopted a resolution to use their power to oppose discrimination against Negroes in the motion picture industry. And beyond that, they set up a committee to meet with the Screenwriters Guild and the Directors Guild and the Motion Picture Producers Association, kind of what would be called the studios, to establish a policy that, quote, presents Negro characters on the screen in the true relation they bear to American life. So this is the late 40s, pretty much 75 years ago, and at that point, 75 years after the end of the Civil War. So while the late 40s featured all sorts of turf wars over who was going to represent the television actors, they continued between SAG and AFTRA. The Supreme Court, looking at the film industry in particular, ordered divestiture of theater holdings by the major studios. And why is this important? Because it's very reminiscent of today's issue with the streaming services, that at the time, studios were no longer allowed to control so much of the production and the dissemination process. Following this significant break, the traditional studio system weakened over the next decades and ultimately just sort of fell apart. So yes, production and distribution or dissemination. In the old days, it was the cans of film literally going to the movie theater. Well, now it is the digital product being streamed on the very same network that is owned by the people who produced the movie or the series. If one party, like Netflix, controls both, then the concept of residuals that increase proportionally for a really well-done job, like a hit movie or a hit TV series, that doesn't happen because it's not part of the existing contract. And there is concern that there's really no way to trace and track and monitor what popular is and how Netflix accounts for that. That's a really important lesson that we learned from history. Now, the progress that starts to get made as TV becomes part of the American lifestyle is that one small studio, Monogram Studios, in 1952 made an agreement with SAG to pay residuals of 70 feature films that had been made in the last 4 years that were licensed for TV, that all of a sudden now, had you been in a movie and now it's being seen on TV, you got more money as an actor, as a writer, as a crew. So SAG then began to negotiate the first contracts for filmed TV programs and the residuals that would stem from those series reruns. And then in 1952 as well, AFTRA became AFTRA with the T representing television. And while they and SAG continued to vie for the top representation of this large growing body of television performers, at least AFTRA was recognizing their ability to meet the needs of radio and television. And as a matter of fact, they built a no discrimination clause into their 1952-53 contract that required producers to not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, creed, color of skin, national origin. And as much as HUAC and the anti-communist fervor had put unions on the defensive just a few years earlier, I think we can give a tremendous amount of credit to SAG and AFTRA that they still found ways to make gains, small bits of ground, though clauses like these were a little toothless. And all you have to do is read Lena Horne's experience to know that it really was toothless, and there were so many workarounds that prevented talented performers of color from making it to TV. Now, we continue, though, to deal with the fact that there was anti-communist fervor. And in fact, in 1953, 96% of the Screen Actors Guild members voted to approve requiring an anti-communist affidavit loyalty oath of all the actors who were joining the guild. And that oath read that I am not now and will not become a member of the Communist Party nor any other organization that seeks to overthrow the government of the United States by force or violence. So when we think about the women and the men who were removed from their jobs because of innuendo, because people were so scared of losing their jobs that they were willing to, without factual merit, implicate other people, that was the kind of hysteria that was going on. And SAG and AFTRA were right in the middle of it, sometimes perpetuating it and sometimes drawing a very hard line in the sand. These are groups that are very used to being right in the middle of some of the most contentious issues. But I'll have you know that oath, that loyalty oath, 20 years later, when the Grateful Dead was appearing in a film and they were told they had to sign off on that loyalty oath, they said no. They scratched it out of their contract. Their contract went through. And just a few years later, SAG eliminated it entirely, 1974. By 1953, the Screenwriters Guild, which is a bit of a predecessor as well to the WGA, it struck for 13 weeks. And the gains that were made were basic platform planks that now are part of the television work experience, residuals, payments for reruns, separation of rights in television in terms of contractual copyright, original works, prohibition of speculative writing in television. You get paid for what you are delivering, and the control of the credits, things like that. So really bringing television up to speed on par with what had been part of the original film writers' standard contracts. In 1954, finally, the writers had centralized power because the Screenwriters Guild merged with a group of other unions to represent persons both on the East and West Coast, radio, television, and film writers. That became the Writers Guild of America, the East and West divisions, but they are jointly administered. And you know what? The modern WGA lists these areas of service and duty for its members, representing members in negotiations with film and television producers, determining writing credits, which is it's a dicey and it's a very specific criteria that has to be met because so much money is premised on that credit, that they monitor and collect and distribute the residual payments to writers. So they act as this very vital intermediary between the payments that are still functioning because the producers are making money off of the work, and then the writers who, by virtue of the work that they have performed, their contract makes them eligible for successive payments for, in many cases, years and decades after the work. And then lastly, the Writers Guild houses the largest screenplay registration service and database, and it adds upwards of 50,000 works annually. Also, in 1953, it's important to note that AFTRA ratified health and retirement benefits into its contract. Again, this becomes part of what is charged to the production company and then is delivered to the individuals as they do the work. And it's important that just like in the real world, their access to healthcare benefits is defined by how much they work in a year. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So here it is, 1957, and we're going to get back to the quest for diversity and inclusion. So there was a luncheon meeting, fancy luncheon meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel The SAG leaders were there to represent the actors, and there were officials from the NAACP and then officials from the Association of Motion Picture Producers, otherwise known as the studios. And the topic of conversation in the lunch was, quote, the misinterpretation of the role of the NAACP regarding Negro roles. And if you've ever read anything on Lena Horne, this is what she talks about. This was very much a part of her career. And that is that the NAACP had no business telling Hollywood, in Hollywood's words, the producers' words, had no business telling them what the roles of people of color should be. And that was that the NAACP and black media, the black newspapers and radio, had created a lot of social pressure for black actors to not accept any role that would feature them as a character of diminished agency or power, like a butler or a maid, or in Lena Horne's case, as a torch singer. There was never just a supporting actor or actress part, let alone a lead. Now, the trouble was that those actors needed to work too, and so many often took the job hoping that conditions would improve. And a good case in point on this is Esther Rolle, who in 1967 played the black maid to Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was a whole storyline about Sidney Poitier and their daughter, Catherine Houghton, being engaged to be married. So Esther Rolle took the job as the black maid in 1967, and only 5 years later would she show up again as a black maid in Maude. And then in 1974, she is liberated to be the co-lead, the co-star of Good Times, and was a mother with a husband and real life. Back to the union conversation, however, it was 1959 that Virginia Payne is the first woman elected president of AFTRA. Payne had had a solid career in radio and 50s television, but it is worth noting that her IMDb profile is silent about her historic leadership of AFTRA. 1960, the Writers Guild of America struck for 22 weeks, and it was about residuals for theatrical motion pictures and license fees and greater residuals for reruns. But it's only in this stage, in the early 60s, that pension funds and health insurance become staples and important aspects of having a career as a professional writer. And it's also at this time that SAG and AFTRA really continued to discuss mergers. They formed committees to review it, but it still took almost 40 years. Over on the AFTRA side in 1963, Vicky Viola was a voice actress and an actress in radio and TV and stage, and she became AFTRA's second female national president. Go to her IMDb, and you too will find no mention of her leadership profile. Jumping back over to diversity, here it is, the early 60s. 20 years since Hattie McDaniel requested more attention be paid to the inequities, and SAG decides to go on the attack, and they force the producers to agree to this American Scene clause, which reads that the parties mutually affirm their policy of non-discrimination in the treatment of any actor because of race, creed, color, or national origin. In accordance with this policy, the producer will make every effort to cast performers belonging to all groups in all types of roles, having due regard for the requirements of a suitability for the role, so that, for example, the American Scene may be portrayed realistically. Again, you'd have dozens of prominent actors in the 60s, prominent actors of color, barred from lead roles in a series or having a variety show in their name, namely Nat King Cole, usually with the rationale provided by the studios or the bigwigs that, well, we know that our advertisers won't sign on as they know it won't sell in the South. That was the line that was used in TV and film throughout the 60s and 70s to prevent proper representation, that it wouldn't sell in the South. Now, 80 years after the Civil War. There are some big strike years that are noted throughout the history of the WGA and SAG and AFTRA. And in 1967, AFTRA had its first national strike, and it only lasted for 13 days, but it queued up many other entertainment union divisions to honor the picket lines. So it really brought everything to a standstill. And this was over something that might seem small, but it was big at the time, and that is the news readers, the staff announcer contracts at the owner-operated stations, news stations in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. That finally these people were under contract as well, and that their contracts were fair. Leap ahead a couple years to 1972, and lo and behold, a SAG Women's Committee is founded, and it reports out that a Brigham Young University study revealed this benchmark of representation. Whoa! 81.7% of the roles on TV are male, and 18.3% are female. And it was in 1972 as well that AFTRA announced the formation of the Ethnic Minorities Committee. Yes, that's what they called them back then. The early 70s are important because that is when you had Title IX gaining its power as a regulation, and then you had the quest for the ERA and what would take place across the 70s to get the ERA ratified. But interestingly, and this is again an understanding that these unions follow technology very closely and how it will affect the work of their creatives in particular, that in 1973, residual payments for work distributed through video cassettes and pay television was starting to factor into negotiations. Just a few years later than 1973, when this was becoming an item of contract negotiation, this ad appeared on TV for the very expensive early home VCR.
Now, some of the best movies on television aren't on television. They're on Select-O-Vision, the 4-hour video cassette recorder from RCA. Because now you can buy full-length uncut movies on cassettes. Movies like Pat and Hello Dolly, and lots more. With Select-O-Vision, you can go to the movies at your house.
Buy now during the RCA Film Festival and get 2 free movies and discount coupons for 5 more.
As with unions across all industries, automation and technology has been introducing major workplace change for the last 50 years at least. So moving forward to the mid-70s, TV actor Kathleen Nolan becomes the 3rd woman SAG president. And believe it or not, listener, yes, finally, this gets mentioned in her IMDb profile. A few years later, under Kathleen Nolan's leadership, SAG and AFTRA strike again, this time the ad agencies and the national brands on behalf of actors in commercials so that they would receive better residuals for their work. And so every time you watch an insurance commercial or a cell phone commercial, you know that their compensation is directly tied to the work that Kathleen Nolan and her team did, these 55 years ago. And Kathleen Nolan, who is not particularly well known on TV, is 89 years old and vibrant, and she has picketed alongside SAG-AFTRA members this summer. In 1979, while not a strike, thinking too, again, about diversity and everything, SAG marched on both coasts calling for more equitable representation of women and persons of color. That's what you had to do in order to press your point back before there was the internet. You had to have marches. You had to write letters to the editor and opinion pieces, and you would expect perhaps that this is part of the SAG and AFTRA sort of progressive agenda. It was coinciding with Congress's extension of the window of time during which the ERA could be ratified by the required 38 legislatures. So marches were effective. They ended up in newspapers across the country. Moving forward to the mid-'80s, 1984 was an attempt to merge SAG and AFTRA, and it failed with a union vote. It required a 60% union vote, and it would still be another couple of decades before it got that. But in that same year, SAG determined that it needed to create a committee to study why women received only, at that time, mid-'80s, 10 to 20% of the voiceover work. I'll have to pay more attention as to whether this has changed in 40 years, going to the various data sources that study representation, because at least in 2023, Alexa and Siri shouldn't count on this data. In 1985, writers walked out over language pertaining to residual payments from home video rentals and sales. They must have heard the male voiceover on that commercial. And so it was also in 1985 that acclaimed actor Patty Duke was elected the 2nd woman president of SAG, and she served for 3 years. And she's admitted that she did not do well at running meetings. She did much better as Patty and Kathy, as an overworked young actor. She didn't run meetings very well because they were filled with 100 opinionated actors, and they were often contentious. But she does think in an interview that she was effective in rallying interest for union issues among members and did certain things to advance the agenda. She was the Grand Marshal of the 1986 West Hollywood Pride Parade, LGBTQ Pride Parade. And her son, Sean Astin, posted this following message on Facebook just months after Duke's rather unexpected passing in 2016. This is Sean Astin. The LAPD told my mom, Patty Duke, that she had received credible death threats for agreeing to participate in this event. She had armed guards with me and my brother at home. She's wearing a bulletproof vest. There's a photo that he included in his Facebook post. The great-looking guy is my stepdad, Sergeant First Class U.S. Army Ranger Michael Ray, all business that day, Pierce. My mom would not be afraid. My mom would not be threatened or intimidated. My mom would not back down. My mom loved, celebrated, and honored gay rights. She was willing to die for them, and she rode that day with absolute pride at the gay parade. When California handed down its horrible anti-gay judgment a few years ago, I marched anonymously late that night with the LGBT protesters. I did this because I remembered my mother's example. She was not indifferent, passive, or blind. While this may seem like it has nothing to do with leading a union, it really does. It has a lot to do with leadership. At that time, she knew that visibility, especially pre-internet, was determined by showing up and being seen and getting media coverage. And Patty Duke had those chops, given the awards she had received and the place she had in America's heart. Duke took her role as president seriously and represented the union's progressive platform flawlessly at a time, just as AIDS was getting going, where there was tremendous fear. Now, just this year, listeners, Americans started paying attention to the fact that it was Fran Drescher, who was known more as the nasal voice Fran Fine from TV's The Nanny, was SAG-AFTRA's president. You know, you just don't track these things if you're in middle America or not in the business. And in fact, Fran Drescher was making bold statements about pay and working conditions. So what separates the Patty Dukes and the Fran Dreschers and all the women presidents of SAG and AFTRA and the WGA is that as women, they've lived a very different experience from their male counterparts in the industry. Whether they're attempting to do their work by writing in Hollywood's notorious frat boy writer's room culture, or performing, receiving less pay and more harassment, the casting couch, just to do their jobs. Just to be a performer. They know how to stand up for themselves. And that should breed a lot of confidence that on these major issues, for as long as it takes, these women are not going to back down and they are going to serve the membership. And the membership needs to recognize that they are not in this to do anything other than win. Now, by 1988, scrolling back 30 some years, along with the DGA, the Directors Guild, and SAG, the Writers Guild won an agreement from the producers and the studios to fund a tri-guild audit program so that the guilds could ensure that the residuals are paid out correctly, that the calculations are auditable, that nobody's making up numbers in order to generate the incomes of the people who have already done the work. History took place again in 1993 when AFTRA elected a Boston newswoman, Shelby Scott, from WBZ as its president. At that time, residuals were doing very well, money was flowing, but studies still pointed to disparity in the on-screen representation of women and persons of color, at least on television. And it was later that decade, 1998, that they understood that the way that the Health Insurance Administration and how it was funded was flawed. So they created a new points system that was established to extend coverage during periods between projects. What happened was, if the benefit was only available if you were working, you had many people who were obviously in between projects. They just were at a different point in their career. Work was not as steady. And so that's why you have examples of like The Love Boat, which ran from 1976 to 86, or Murder, She Wrote from 1984 to 1996. There were so many cameo appearances from kind of obscure, I haven't seen that person in a while, because this created the work and the credit that enabled these performers otherwise to get health insurance. They would have been ineligible had they not appeared on game shows and The Love Boat and love American style, whatever it was. So every time that there were limitations, there were some workarounds for a period of time, but finally the unions recognized that the formula or how it was created was flawed. In 2000, kind of just on the dot-com bubble, the unions started to keep an eye on how residuals were being defined and computed, and they actually fought to include language that related to, and this is a phrase, made for internet audio-visual programming. A little clunky. We know a different series of phrases today, but this has now been 23 years on their radar, expecting and determining the position of where it should be, given the fact that technology still was going to throw in some unknowns. In 2001, Victoria Riskin became the first woman elected president to the WGA. And there was a license fee established, a residual for an internet rental, which included subscription video on demand. Remember getting the video in the mail, the DVD in the mail? Victoria Riskin is noted in her Wikipedia file as saying that at that time as well, working with the WGA and leading it, that she was dedicated to eliminating the phrase, "this film by." It was credit that was sort of established, particularly for the major producers or writers, that they were claiming sole authorship of a work that is larger than that now. You can't just claim that you did the whole film by yourself, and that it's important for that authorship to be shared because it means money for the people who did the work. There will be another episode of Advanced TV Herstory where I interview Victoria Riskin and learn from her what were the important highlights of her tenure as the first woman president of the Writers Guild. I look forward to doing that, and please look for it. We are getting into the aughts, and that means we're getting close to today, and we're not even really going to talk much more about the issues of today. But know that new media continued to play a role in the contracts that were getting negotiated, and that there was a 100-day strike in 2007 and 2008 over content that was made for new media and how the residuals for those new media platforms would be calculated, including digital downloads. So by 2020, and this is a few years after the SAG-AFTRA merger, the leadership was starting to pay attention to the solvency of the healthcare funds, and they established a paid parental benefit for members that enabled them to either welcome a new child or adopt a child or secure placement of a foster child in their home. And the WGA scratched, this is important, the new writer discount and trainee wage that was part of contracts with studios. And those categories impacted writers from underrepresented groups, people of color, women, because they resulted in less pay. It's enough to be paying your dues and to be learning and to be dedicating yourself to learning the craft. It's another thing to be doing it for so much less money than everybody else. So when in 2020, earning losses were starting to rise from the fact that COVID had produced this work stoppage, that the unions had to cut back on services and benefits. And at that time, Gabriel Carteris from Beverly Hills 90210 was leading SAG-AFTRA. She actually was the president of the merged entity from 2016 to 2021. In 2021, she decided to no longer lead the organization. She had led it through the worst part of COVID. She supported Fran Drescher's bid for the presidency. But available on the SAG-AFTRA site, this is Carteris's delivered message as the world was just beginning to realize the severity of the pandemic. It's kind of cool that these videos are still available to understand how each industry was responding to something that we hardly knew anything about.
I recognize that one of the most challenging concerns facing our members during this national emergency is the loss of work. I mean, that causes untold economic pain and hardship. So I want you to know that we have been in direct conversations with other unions, studios, employers, and legislative leaders at the state and federal level to make sure entertainment workers are included in the stimulus package for income replacement programs. Programs like expanded unemployment insurance, family relief, a universal basic income during this crisis. And there's so much more that you can find on the resources page, which we are constantly updating in this evolving situation. You just need to go to sagaftra.org/COVID-19. Please, I want you to check it out, take action, make sure that our collective voices are heard.
Brings us to today and the conditions upon which the studios and networks are at a standoff with a very united labor community, namely the compensation from the explosion of direct-to-viewer distribution via streaming and online services, and also recognizing the vast power of technology, the question of use and control of artificial intelligence in the creation of art, and that it has a direct bearing on the lives of people everywhere, not just those in entertainment. Again, I want to highlight the fact that this movement in 2023 is being led by women. The current Writers Guild West president is writer and producer Meredith Stiehm, who is credited with creating Cold Case, the series Cold Case, and she was a writer on Northern Exposure and Homeland and NYPD Blue. And the recently elected Writers Guild East president, Lisa Takeuchi Cullen, who's a Japanese-American writer and producer. She has an overall deal with Universal Studios, projects in development all over the place. She's created a number of pilots for all of the major networks, including A&E and Warner Brothers. She's been an executive producer on a number of shows. Keep your eye, listeners. Keep your eye on Lisa Takeuchi Cullen.
Eyewitness News reporter Amy Powell has more on why the unions are banding together.
Everywhere we go! Everywhere we go! The people want to know! The people want to know!
A massive show of solidarity. Hundreds of union workers joining a march and rally in downtown Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Federation of Labor organizing the multi-union gathering, including food service and hotel workers, Teamsters, striking members of the Writers Guild of America, and teachers. Organizers say labor negotiations are underway in some industries. Union leaders say workers struggle to pay for food and gas and find affordable housing. Striking writers have been on the picket lines for weeks, fighting for higher pay for streaming programs and other improvements. Amy Powell, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Final note. As of August 2023, there's been little movement amongst all the parties to even return to the bargaining table. However, as Fran Drescher said in her announcement, the eyes of the world and the labor movement are on this movement, on this work stoppage. And I will add that the eyes of the world are on these women. This is why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Now get out there and do right by Labor Day 2023. There are great resources for the WGA and SAG-AFTRA in the show notes, as are links to the audio used in this episode. Many thanks to Jazzer for creating our jingle, Take Me Higher, which is found at freemusicarchive.org. A shout out to this podcast's Betsy Ross, our very own Mary Lou Morose. You stitch all these clips together into this larger, otherwise tedious narrative, and we are smarter for it. Listeners, do stay in touch. Thanks for listening. You really are the best. Happy Labor Day.